The morning sun cast long shadows across the Afghan mountains as Lieutenant Sarah Chen adjusted her position behind the rocky outcrop. Her Barrett M82A150 caliber rifle lay beside her, its massive frame gleaming in the early light. She had been watching the valley below for 3 hours, waiting for her team to return from their reconnaissance mission. Sarah was not supposed to be here. As a Navy sniper attached to SEAL Team 6 for this operation, her orders were clear. Provide overwatch from the designated position 2 clicks north. But something had felt wrong about the mission briefing. The intelligence seemed too clean, too convenient. Her instincts, honed through 4 tours in hostile territory, screamed danger. When she spotted the dust cloud approaching from the east, her heart sank. Through her scope, she could make out the familiar silhouettes of her teammates, but they were moving wrong. Instead of the confident stride of victorious warriors, they stumbled and weaved like wounded animals. Behind them, a much larger force was closing in fast. The radio crackled to life. Viper 1, this is Alpha Team, we are compromised. Multiple hostiles in pursuit. Request immediate extraction. The voice belonged to Commander James Mitchell, the team leader she had worked with for 6 months. She could hear the strain in his voice, the carefully controlled panic of a man who knew his team was in serious trouble. Sarah grabbed her radio. Alpha Team, this is Viper 1. I have visual on your position. Count 30+ hostiles closing from your 6. What is your status? We have 2 wounded. Johnson took shrapnel to the leg. Rodriguez has a bullet in his shoulder. We cannot maintain current pace much longer. Mitchell's breathing was labored as he spoke between footsteps. Through her scope, Sarah could see the pursuing force more clearly now. They were not the usual Taliban fighters the team had been expecting. These men moved with military precision, carried advanced equipment and wore uniforms she did not recognize. This was a professional military unit, possibly foreign special forces. The tactical situation was becoming clearer by the minute. Her team had walked into a trap, and now they were being hunted by an enemy force that outnumbered them 6-1. The extraction point was still 3 kilometers away, across open ground that offered little cover. At their current pace, with wounded teammates slowing them down, they would never make it. Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She keyed her radio again. Alpha Team changed direction to grid reference 774218. There is a defensive position at the base of the ridgeline. I will provide cover fire and meet you there. Negative, Viper 1. Maintain your position and call for air support. Mitchell's response was immediate and firm, but Sarah was already moving. She had spotted something through her scope that made her blood run cold. The pursuing force was splitting into 2 groups. One continued the direct pursuit while the other was flanking around to the north, heading directly toward the extraction point. They were not just chasing her teammates. They were herding them into a carefully planned ambush. She slung the Barrett across her back and began moving down the mountain slope, using the terrain to mask her movement. The rifle weighed nearly 30 pounds, but she had carried it through worse terrain than this. Her mind was already calculating angles, distances, and timing. If she could reach the position she had identified, she might be able to even the odds. The position was a natural depression in the rock face, offering excellent fields of fire while providing protection from return shots. More importantly, it would allow her to engage both groups of enemies simultaneously. It was a sniper's dream position, but it also meant abandoning her escape route. Once she took that position, there would be no way out. As she moved, Sarah reflected on the path that had brought her to this moment. Growing up in a military family, she had always known she would serve. Her father had been a Marine sniper in Vietnam, and he had taught her to shoot before she could properly ride a bicycle. When she enlisted in the Navy, everyone assumed she would follow a traditional path. Instead, she had fought for the right to attend sniper school, becoming one of only a handful of women to earn the designation. The SEAL teams had been reluctant to accept her at first. She was an outsider, a woman in a brotherhood that had always been exclusively male, but her skills spoke louder than prejudice. Her record of confirmed kills was impressive, but more importantly, she had never lost a teammate under her watch. Today she was determined to keep that record intact. The sound of gunfire echoed across the valley, snapping her back to the present. The first shots had been fired, which meant the chase had become a running battle. She could see muzzle flashes in the distance, and knew her teammates were making their stand. But they were still outnumbered and running low on ammunition. Sarah reached her chosen position and quickly set up the Barrett. The massive rifle required careful preparation, and she went through her routine with practiced efficiency. She adjusted the bipod legs, checked the scope alignment, and chambered around. The .50 caliber bullet was as long as her finger and packed enough power to punch through engine blocks. Through her scope, she could see the tactical situation developing. Her teammates had taken cover behind a cluster of boulders, but the enemy was closing in from multiple directions. The wounded men were being protected in the center of the formation, while the others returned fire with what ammunition they had left. The flanking force was now in position, setting up what appeared to be a heavy machine gun on the ridgeline above her teammates. Once that weapon opened fire, the battle would be over in minutes. Sarah knew she had perhaps 30 seconds before her teammates would be caught in a devastating crossfire, with no hope of escape. She took a deep breath and settled into her shooting position, feeling the familiar calm that always came before action. The Barrett's scope revealed details that made Sarah's tactical assessment even more grim. The enemy force was better equipped than any Taliban unit she had encountered. They carried modern assault rifles, wore body armor, and moved with the coordination of seasoned professionals. Their leader, a tall man with lieutenant colonel insignia, was directing the assault with hand signals that spoke of extensive military training. Sarah's finger found the trigger as she calculated wind speed and distance. The heavy machine gun crew was her primary target. Once they opened fire from their elevated position, her teammates would be trapped in a kill zone with no possibility of escape. She had perhaps 20 seconds before they completed their setup. The first shot from the Barrett split the mountain air like thunder. The massive .50 caliber round traveled at over 2,800 feet per second, covering the 800-meter distance in less than a second. The enemy machine gunner's head disappeared in a pink mist, and his body toppled backward off the ridge. The second enemy soldier manning the gun looked up in confusion, trying to locate the source of the shot. Sarah was already chambering another round. Her second shot took him center mass, the massive bullet punching through his body armor like paper. The heavy machine gun tumbled down the rocky slope, useless, but Sarah's position was now compromised. Muzzle flashes and the distinctive boom of the Barrett had given away her location. She could see enemy soldiers pointing in her direction, and several were already moving to flank her position. She had bought her teammates time, but now she faced the same problem they did: overwhelming numbers and limited escape routes. Commander Mitchell's voice crackled through her radio. "Viper 1, what is your position?" "We heard the Barrett. I am 800 meters northwest of your position, engaging the flanking force. The heavy gun is neutralized, but I have multiple hostiles moving on my location." Sarah kept her voice calm and professional, even as she tracked another target through her scope. Her third shot eliminated an enemy soldier who was trying to set up a rocket-propelled grenade launcher. The weapon spun away into the rocks and the soldier's body crumpled behind a boulder. But for every enemy she eliminated, 2 more seemed to take their place. The enemy commander was shouting orders in a language Sarah did not recognize. It was not Pashto or Arabic, but something else entirely. Russian, perhaps, or one of the Eastern European languages. This confirmation that they were facing foreign special forces made the situation even more dangerous. These men were not local fighters defending their territory. They were professionals with specific orders and likely significant support. Sarah's radio crackled again. "Viper 1, we are moving to your position. Hold tight. Negative, Alpha Team. Maintain your current position. I will come to you." But even as she said it, Sarah knew the tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. The enemy force was now fully aware of her presence and was coordinating a multi-directional assault on her position. She fired her 4th shot, taking down a soldier who was advancing up the slope toward her. The man had been using cover effectively, but the Barrett's massive power meant that even partial concealment was useless. The bullet punched through the rock he was hiding behind and eliminated him instantly. The return fire was becoming more accurate. Bullets sparked off the rocks around her position, and she could hear the distinctive whistle of rounds passing close to her head. She needed to move, but leaving her current position meant abandoning the elevated advantage that made the Barrett so effective. Through her scope, she could see her teammates beginning to advance. Despite her orders to remain in place, they were moving to support her. She felt a mixture of pride and frustration. These men would risk everything to help a teammate, but their advance was putting them in even greater danger. Sarah made another tactical decision. If her teammates were determined to reach her position, she would make their advance as safe as possible. She shifted her aim to the enemy soldiers who posed the greatest threat to the advancing SEALs. Her fifth shot eliminated an enemy sniper who had been tracking Commander Mitchell through his own scope. The enemy marksman had been well concealed, but Sarah's elevated position allowed her to spot the glint of his scope lens. The 50 caliber round ended his threat permanently. The sixth shot took down another soldier, who was preparing to throw a grenade at her teammates' position. The explosive device detonated harmlessly among the rocks, sending up a shower of stone fragments but causing no casualties. But the enemy was adapting to her tactics. They had identified her as the primary threat, and were concentrating their fire on her position. The volume of incoming rounds was making it impossible for her to maintain aimed fire. She was forced to keep her head down, breaking the visual contact that made her so effective. The enemy commander was coordinating a final assault. Sarah could see him directing soldiers to approach her position from 3 different directions. They were using suppressive fire to keep her pinned down while assault teams moved to eliminate her. She keyed her radio one more time. "Alpha team, I'm about to be overrun. Continue to extraction point. Do not attempt rescue." Mitchell's response was immediate and heated. "Like hell, Viper 1, we are coming to get you." Through the chaos of gunfire and shouting, Sarah heard something that changed everything. The distinctive sound of helicopter rotors was echoing off the mountain walls. But instead of relief, she felt a new surge of concern. The sound was wrong for American aircraft. These rotors had the deeper, more aggressive note of Russian-made helicopters. The enemy force was about to receive reinforcements, and the tactical situation was about to become impossible. Sarah looked through her scope one more time and saw the enemy commander speaking into his radio with obvious satisfaction. He was coordinating with the incoming aircraft, preparing to turn a difficult situation into a complete victory. Sarah chambered another round and made a decision that would define the rest of the battle. Instead of continuing to engage the soldiers approaching her position, she swung the Barrett toward the enemy commander. If she could eliminate their leadership, the coordinated assault might collapse into confusion. The range was nearly 1,000 meters, and the target was partially concealed behind a boulder. But Sarah had made more difficult shots under worse conditions. She controlled her breathing, calculated for wind and elevation, and placed her crosshairs on the small portion of the commander's torso that was visible. The Barrett roared for the 7th time, and Sarah watched through her scope as the enemy commander spun and fell. But instead of collapsing, he rolled behind cover, clutching his shoulder. The shot had wounded him but not eliminated him as a threat. The helicopters were getting closer, and Sarah could now see them through her scope. 2 large transport aircraft, probably capable of carrying 20 soldiers each. The enemy force was about to double in size, and her teammates would face impossible odds. She made one final radio call. "Alpha team, multiple aircraft inbound with reinforcements. Recommend immediate withdrawal to alternate extraction point." But as she spoke, Sarah was already moving to implement a plan that would give her teammates the time they needed to escape. Sarah abandoned her sniper position and began moving down the slope with the Barrett slung across her back. The massive rifle made stealth impossible, but stealth was no longer an option. The helicopters would land within minutes, and when they did, her teammates would face a force of over 50 enemy soldiers in terrain that offered no escape routes. The plan forming in her mind was desperate, but tactically sound. The helicopters would need to land in the only suitable area in the valley, a flat section of ground near a dried riverbed. If she could reach a position overlooking that landing zone, the Barrett's long-range capability would allow her to engage the aircraft before they could disembark their troops. Moving through the rocky terrain while carrying the 30-pound rifle required every bit of her physical conditioning. The weight threw off her balance on the steep slopes, and several times she nearly lost her footing on loose gravel. But years of training had prepared her for exactly this kind of movement under pressure. Behind her, she could hear the enemy soldiers pursuing both her and her teammates. The gunfire was becoming more sporadic, which meant her teammates were conserving ammunition for the final confrontation. They had limited supplies and no possibility of resupply, while the enemy could afford to maintain suppressive fire indefinitely. The helicopters were now close enough that she could identify their type through quick glances upward. They were Mi-17 transport aircraft, Russian-made and capable of carrying a full squad each. More concerning was the fact that she could see door gunners manning heavy machine guns mounted in the aircraft doorways. These were not simple transport runs. They were combat insertions by experienced crews. Sarah reached the position she had identified, a cluster of large boulders that provided both concealment and a clear field of fire toward the landing zone. She quickly set up the Barrett again, using the stable platform of the rocks to support the heavy rifle. Through her scope, she could see the first helicopter beginning its landing approach. The tactical situation required split-second timing. She needed to engage the aircraft during the most vulnerable phase of their landing, when they were too low to maneuver effectively, but had not yet disembarked their troops. The window of opportunity would last perhaps 30 seconds. Her radio crackled with Commander Mitchell's voice. "Viper 1, we can see your position. We are moving to support. Negative, Alpha Team, continue withdrawal. I have the aircraft." Sarah's response was calm and controlled, but inside she felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came before major combat engagements. The first helicopter was now in a stable hover, preparing to touch down. Through her scope, Sarah could see the door gunners scanning for targets while the pilots focused on the landing. The aircraft was presenting its side profile to her position, offering the largest possible target. Sarah aimed for the engine compartment, where a .50 caliber round would cause maximum damage. The Barrett's massive bullet could punch through the aircraft's light armor and destroy critical components. But she would have only one shot before the helicopter crew realized they were under attack and took evasive action. The rifle bucked against her shoulder as she fired. Through her scope, she watched the massive bullet impact the helicopter's engine housing. Sparks flew from the aircraft's side and black smoke began pouring from the damaged compartment. The pilot immediately pulled up, trying to gain altitude and escape the threat, but the damage was too severe. The helicopter's engine was failing, and the aircraft began to wobble in the air. Sarah watched as the pilot fought to maintain control, but the damaged aircraft was losing power rapidly. It crashed into the mountainside 300 meters from the intended landing zone, erupting in a ball of flame that sent thick black smoke into the sky. The second helicopter pilot had witnessed the destruction of the first aircraft and was taking evasive action. Instead of landing in the open area, he was maneuvering to use the terrain features for concealment while still allowing his troops to disembark. Sarah tracked the aircraft through her scope, but the pilot was keeping the helicopter in constant motion, making a precision shot extremely difficult. She needed the aircraft to present a stable target for at least 2 seconds, but the pilot was too experienced to give her that opportunity. The helicopter finally settled into a hover behind a ridgeline, using the terrain to mask its position from Sarah's line of sight. She could hear the aircraft's engines but could not see it to engage. The enemy troops would be disembarking now, adding 20 more soldiers to the force already pursuing her teammates. Sarah's radio erupted with activity. "All units, this is Reaper 27. We are inbound to your position with close air support." The voice belonged to an American pilot, and Sarah felt a surge of hope. Someone had finally responded to their calls for assistance. But the enemy commander, wounded but still functional, was also coordinating with his air support. Sarah could hear additional helicopters in the distance approaching from the east. The battle was about to escalate far beyond a small unit engagement. Through her scope, Sarah could see her teammates had reached a defensive position among a cluster of large boulders. They had good fields of fire and solid cover, but they were still outnumbered by at least 3 to 1. The wounded members of the team, Johnson and Rodriguez, were being positioned in the center of the formation, where they could contribute defensive fire while being protected by their teammates. The enemy force was now surrounding the SEAL position, preparing for a coordinated assault from multiple directions. Sarah could see them moving into position, using hand signals to coordinate their timing. They were professionals, and they understood that a simultaneous attack from several directions would overwhelm any defensive position. Sarah made another tactical decision. She could not reach her teammates' position before the assault began, but she could disrupt the enemy's coordination by eliminating key personnel. She began tracking the enemy soldiers who appeared to be team leaders, looking for the men who were directing the movements of others. Her next shot eliminated a soldier who was positioning a group of fighters on the north side of the SEAL position. The man had been using hand signals to direct his team's movement when the .50 caliber bullet ended his commands permanently. The soldiers he had been directing immediately took cover. Their coordinated advance disrupted. Sarah's second shot took down another team leader on the south side of the battlefield. The massive bullet punched through the rocks he was using for concealment, eliminating him and causing his team to lose cohesion. The carefully planned, simultaneous assault was beginning to unravel as individual units lost their coordination, but the enemy force was large enough to absorb these losses and still maintain overwhelming numerical superiority. Sarah could see new leaders emerging, taking control of the disrupted units and re-establishing coordination. The assault would proceed, just with slightly less precision than originally planned. The sound of American aircraft was getting closer, but Sarah knew they might not arrive in time to prevent the final assault on her teammates' position. She needed to do something dramatic to disrupt the enemy's timing and give the air support time to reach the battlefield. Through her scope, she spotted the wounded enemy commander. He was directing the overall assault from a position several hundred meters behind the front lines, using a radio to coordinate with his various units. If she could eliminate him, the entire operation might collapse into confusion. The shot would be extremely difficult. The range was over 1,200 meters, the target was partially concealed, and Sarah would be shooting at a steep downward angle that would affect her bullet's trajectory. But it was the kind of shot that could change the outcome of the entire battle. Sarah controlled her breathing, calculated for all the variables she could identify, and placed her crosshairs on the small portion of the enemy commander that was visible. The Barrett roared once more, and she watched through her scope as the .50 caliber bullet found its target. The enemy commander dropped his radio and collapsed behind the boulder he had been using for cover. Sarah could not confirm whether the shot had been fatal, but the immediate effect was obvious. The coordinated radio chatter directing the assault suddenly went silent, and she could see enemy soldiers looking around in confusion as they lost contact with their leadership. The tactical advantage was temporary, but Sarah intended to maximize it. She shifted her aim to the radio equipment the commander had been using, sending a .50 caliber round through the communications setup. Sparks flew from the destroyed equipment, ensuring that even if the commander survived, he would not be able to re-establish contact with his scattered units. The disruption of enemy communications created exactly the opening Sarah had hoped for. Without central coordination, the various enemy units began acting independently, launching uncoordinated attacks instead of the carefully timed simultaneous assault that would have overwhelmed her teammates' position. The first group to attack came from the eastern approach, where the terrain offered the best concealment. Sarah watched through her scope as 8 enemy soldiers moved toward the SEAL position in a textbook assault formation, but without support from other directions, they would face the concentrated defensive fire of the entire SEAL team. Commander Mitchell's voice came through the radio, calm and controlled despite the desperate situation. All stations, enemy assault inbound from the east. Conserve ammunition and wait for my command. Sarah could see her teammates preparing for the engagement. They had positioned themselves to create interlocking fields of fire, ensuring that any attack would face defensive shooting from multiple angles. The wounded members of the team, Johnson and Rodriguez, had been given positions where they could contribute to the defense despite their injuries. The Barrett was not the ideal weapon for supporting this kind of close-range defensive action, but Sarah could still contribute by eliminating threats before they reached her teammate's position. She tracked the lead enemy soldier through her scope, a man carrying what appeared to be a light machine gun that could devastate the SEAL position if he reached effective range. Her shot eliminated the machine gunner before he could deploy his weapon. The massive .50 caliber bullet sent the man tumbling backward down the slope, and his weapon scattered among the rocks. The other soldiers in his unit immediately went to ground, their advance halted by the sudden loss of their heavy firepower. But eliminating one threat only revealed another. Sarah spotted a second group of enemy soldiers approaching from the north, moving through a ravine that would bring them within grenade range of her teammate's position. This group had been coordinating with the eastern assault, but with communications disrupted, they were proceeding with their attack regardless of what was happening elsewhere on the battlefield. Sarah swung the Barrett toward this new threat, but the range and angle made engagement difficult. The soldiers were using the ravine for concealment, and only brief glimpses of them were visible as they moved between cover points. She needed them to present a clear target. but they were too experienced to expose themselves unnecessarily. The sound of American aircraft was now clearly audible, and Sarah could see the distinctive silhouette of an A-10 Thunderbolt approaching from the west. The aircraft's twin engines and straight wings were unmistakable, and Sarah knew that the massive GAU-8 cannon mounted in its nose could eliminate the entire enemy force in a matter of minutes. But the close proximity of friendly and enemy forces would make air support extremely dangerous. The A-10 pilot would need precise target identification to avoid hitting the SEAL team, and with the tactical situation changing rapidly, coordination would be critical. Sarah keyed her radio. Reaper 27, this is Viper 1. Friendly forces are in defensive positions at grid reference 774218. Enemy forces are approaching from multiple directions. Request you hold until we can mark targets. The pilot's response was immediate. Copy Viper 1. I have visual on defensive position. Standing by for target marking. But target marking required someone to designate enemy positions, and Sarah was the only friendly force with a clear view of the entire battlefield. She would need to identify each enemy group and guide the air support to eliminate them without endangering her teammates. Through her scope, she could see the Eastern Assault Group had resumed their advance. The loss of their machine gunner had slowed them down, but they were still moving toward the SEAL position with determination. 8 soldiers with assault rifles could still overwhelm a defensive position through weight of fire, especially when the defenders had limited ammunition. Sarah aimed carefully and fired again. Her bullet eliminated the apparent leader of the Eastern Group, a man who had been using hand signals to coordinate his team's movement. The remaining soldiers immediately went to ground again, their advance stalling as they tried to identify the threat that was eliminating their leadership. The Northern Group was now dangerously close to her teammates' position. Sarah could see them preparing to assault from the ravine, using grenades and suppressive fire to overwhelm the defensive position. They were perhaps 50 meters from launching their attack when Sarah spotted them through her scope. Her next shot eliminated the soldier carrying the team's grenades. The man had been moving between cover points when the .50 caliber bullet found him, and the explosive devices he was carrying detonated in a secondary explosion that sent rocks and debris flying throughout the ravine. The blast killed 2 other soldiers and wounded several more, effectively eliminating the Northern threat. But Sarah's position was now being targeted by every enemy soldier who could identify her location. The massive muzzle flash and distinctive sound of the Barrett made concealment impossible, and return fire was becoming increasingly accurate. Bullets sparked off the rocks around her position, and she could hear the whistle of rounds passing dangerously close. She needed to relocate, but movement would mean abandoning the elevated position that made the Barrett so effective. From ground level, her ability to support her teammates and coordinate with the air support would be severely limited. Sarah made the decision to maintain her position despite the incoming fire. Her teammates needed her overwatch capability, and the A-10 pilot needed her target designation to safely engage the enemy forces. She would hold this position as long as possible, regardless of the personal risk. Commander Mitchell's voice came through her radio. Viper 1, we can see your position taking fire. Recommend you displace immediately. Negative, Alpha Team, I have responsibility for air support coordination. Maintaining current position. Sarah's response was calm, but she could feel the intensity of the enemy fire increasing as more soldiers identified her location. The A-10 pilot interrupted the exchange. Viper 1, I need immediate target designation. I have limited fuel and multiple enemy forces in the area. Sarah looked through her scope and began the complex process of identifying enemy positions for airstrike. She could see at least 3 distinct groups of enemy soldiers, all within dangerous proximity to her teammates' position. The margin for error was essentially 0, and any mistake would result in friendly casualties. She keyed her radio and began the target designation that would determine the outcome of the battle. Reaper 27, first target is Eastern Slope. 8 soldiers in scattered positions approximately 200 meters east of friendly position. Second target is Southern Approach. 6 soldiers moving through Boulder Field approximately 150 meters south of friendly position. As she spoke, Sarah continued to engage targets with the Barrett, trying to disrupt enemy movements and buy time for the air support to complete its attack runs. But the enemy fire was becoming overwhelming, and she knew her position would soon become untenable. The A-10 Thunderbolt rolled into its attack run, with the distinctive howl of its twin engines. Sarah watched through her scope as the aircraft lined up on the eastern slope, where the largest concentration of enemy soldiers had taken cover. The pilot's voice came through her radio, calm and professional despite the complex tactical situation. Viper 1, engaging eastern target. Danger close. All friendlies keep heads down. The GAU-8 cannon erupted with a sound like ripping canvas amplified 1,000 times. The massive 30mm depleted uranium rounds chewed through the rocky slope, sending up fountains of stone and dust. Enemy soldiers who had thought themselves safely concealed behind boulders discovered that their cover was inadequate against the A-10's devastating firepower. Sarah maintained her overwatch position despite the increasing volume of return fire. Through her scope, she could see the devastating effect of the airstrike. The Eastern Assault Group had been completely eliminated, their positions marked only by smoking craters and scattered equipment. But other enemy forces were still maneuvering to attack her teammates. Reaper 2-7, excellent work on eastern target. Second target is now moving through the boulder field on the southern approach. Count 6 hostiles. Range 150 meters south of friendly position. Sarah's target designation was precise, but the tactical situation was becoming increasingly complex. The A-10 pilot acknowledged and began maneuvering for his second attack run. But Sarah could see additional enemy soldiers emerging from concealed positions, apparently reinforcements from the helicopter that had successfully landed earlier. The battle was far from over, and her teammates were still facing overwhelming odds. Through her scope, Sarah spotted a new threat that made her blood run cold. A group of enemy soldiers was setting up what appeared to be a mortar system on a ridgeline overlooking the SEAL position. Once that weapon system became operational, it would rain explosive shells down on her teammates' defensive position, making their cover useless. Sarah swung the Barrett toward this new threat, calculating range and windage for what would be an extremely difficult shot. The mortar crew was over 1,000 meters away, positioned on higher ground and partially concealed behind rock formations. But if she could eliminate the crew before they completed their setup, she could prevent a catastrophic escalation of the enemy's firepower. Her first shot at the mortar position missed by inches, the massive bullet striking the rocks near the weapon system and sending up a shower of stone fragments. The enemy soldiers immediately scattered, but they left the mortar tube in place, suggesting they planned to return and complete the setup once they identified the threat to their position. Sarah chambered another round and adjusted her aim. The mortar crew was now aware they were being targeted by a sniper, and they were using better concealment as they attempted to return to their weapon. She needed to eliminate them before they could bring the mortar into action, but the range and angles were testing the limits of her capabilities. Her second shot found its target. The .50 caliber bullet eliminated one of the mortar crew members, and the others immediately abandoned their position, leaving the weapon system unmanned. The immediate threat was neutralized, but Sarah knew they would likely return with additional personnel and better protection. The A-10 was now engaging the southern target, its cannon fire sending more enemy soldiers diving for cover among the boulder field. But the close proximity to the SEAL position meant the pilot had to be extremely precise with his targeting, and Sarah could see that some enemy soldiers were using the terrain to avoid the airstrikes. Commander Mitchell's voice came through her radio. Viper 1, we have movement on the western approach. Multiple hostiles using the dry riverbed for concealment. They appear to be flanking our position. Sarah immediately shifted her attention to the new threat. Through her scope, she could see enemy soldiers moving through the dried riverbed, using its banks for protection as they maneuvered to attack the SEAL position from an unexpected direction. This group had waited for the airstrikes to focus attention elsewhere before beginning their own assault. The tactical situation was becoming untenable. Despite the air support and Sarah's long-range engagement, enemy forces were still managing to coordinate attacks from multiple directions. Her teammates were running low on ammunition, had 2 wounded personnel, and were facing a force that seemed to have unlimited reinforcements. Sarah made a decision that would fundamentally change the nature of the engagement. Instead of continuing to react to enemy movements, she would take the initiative and force them to respond to her actions. She began moving from her overwatch position, carrying the Barrett toward a location that would allow her to engage the flanking force directly. The movement down the steep slope was treacherous while carrying the massive rifle, But Sarah's physical conditioning and mountain warfare training enabled her to maintain both speed and stealth. She was abandoning the elevated position that had made her so effective. But she was also removing herself as a static target for enemy fire. Her new position was a cluster of boulders that provided cover while offering multiple firing lanes toward the approaches to her teammates' defensive position. From here, she could engage enemy forces at closer range, where the Barrett's massive power would be even more devastating. The western flanking force was now within 300 meters of the SEAL position, moving through the riverbed with tactical precision. Sarah could see 8 soldiers in the formation, armed with assault rifles and what appeared to be rocket-propelled grenades. If they reached effective range, they could eliminate the SEAL defensive position with concentrated fire. Sarah's first shot from her new position eliminated the leader of the flanking force. The .50 caliber bullet struck the man's center mass, the massive round's energy lifting him off his feet and sending his body tumbling down the riverbed. The other soldiers immediately took cover, their coordinated advance disrupted by the sudden appearance of devastating sniper fire from an unexpected direction. But Sarah's movement had been observed by other enemy forces, and she was now receiving concentrated fire from multiple directions. The tactical situation had evolved into a running gun battle, with both sides maneuvering for advantage while engaging at ranges from 50 to over 1,000 meters. The A-10 pilot's voice cut through the radio chatter. "All stations, I am Winchester on 30mm and need to return to base for rearm and refuel. ETA for return is 4-5 minutes. Sarah felt a surge of concern. Without air support, the tactical balance would shift dramatically in favor of the enemy forces. Her teammates would face the remaining enemy soldiers without the devastating firepower that had been keeping them suppressed. The next few minutes would determine whether they could hold their position until the A-10 returned. She keyed her radio. "Alpha Team, air support is departing for rearm. Recommend we consolidate our position and prepare for final assault." Commander Mitchell's response was immediate. "Roger, Viper 1. We are low on ammunition but ready to make our stand. Can you reach our position?" Sarah looked at the terrain between her current location and her teammate's defensive position. The distance was manageable, but the route would expose her to fire from at least 3 different enemy positions. With the Barrett's weight and size, she would be extremely vulnerable during the movement, but her teammates needed her firepower, and unity of command required all friendly forces to be in the same location. Sarah made the decision to attempt the dangerous movement, knowing that failure would leave her teammates without her support when they needed it most. Sarah began her movement toward her teammate's position, using every available piece of cover to mask her approach. The Barrett's weight made speed impossible, but she compensated with careful route selection and precise timing. Each bound between cover points was calculated to minimize her exposure to enemy fire. Halfway through her movement, disaster struck. An enemy soldier armed with a rocket-propelled grenade had positioned himself to intercept her route. Sarah saw the distinctive smoke trail of the launched projectile and threw herself behind a boulder just as the warhead exploded against the rocks above her. The explosion showered her with stone fragments and left her ears ringing. But the Barrett was undamaged. More concerning was the fact that her position was now known to multiple enemy forces, and she could hear them coordinating to surround her location. Through the dust and smoke, Sarah could see her teammates' defensive position under heavy assault. The enemy forces had used her movement as an opportunity to launch a coordinated attack, knowing that her supporting fire would be temporarily unavailable. Muzzle flashes lit up the mountainside as both sides engaged in intense close-range combat. Sarah made a tactical decision that would define the final phase of the battle. Instead of continuing toward her teammate's position, she would use her current location to maximum advantage. The boulder she was sheltering behind provided excellent protection, while offering clear fields of fire toward multiple enemy positions. She set up the Barrett quickly, using the stable platform of the rocks to support the massive rifle. Through her scope, she could see enemy soldiers advancing on her teammates from 3 different directions. The SEAL defensive position was being overwhelmed by sheer weight of numbers. Despite the excellent marksmanship and tactical discipline of her teammates, Sarah's first shot eliminated an enemy soldier who was advancing with a light machine gun toward the northern edge of the SEAL position. The massive .50 caliber round sent the weapon spinning away among the rocks. denying the enemy the concentrated firepower they needed to suppress the defensive position. Her second shot took down a soldier armed with grenades who was maneuvering to within throwing range of her teammates. The explosive devices scattered harmlessly among the rocks, eliminating a threat that could have devastated the defensive position. But the enemy forces were now focusing their attention on Sarah's position. She could see soldiers moving to flank her location from both sides, while others maintained suppressive fire to keep her pinned down. The tactical situation was becoming desperate for both her and her teammates. Commander Mitchell's voice cut through the radio static. Viper 1, we are down to our last magazines. Request immediate support. Sarah looked through her scope at her teammate's position and felt a surge of pride mixed with determination. Despite being outnumbered, wounded, and low on ammunition, the SEALs were maintaining disciplined fire and holding their defensive positions. They were buying time with their lives, trusting that reinforcements would arrive before their ammunition ran out completely. The sound of approaching aircraft filled the valley, but Sarah's heart sank as she identified the source. More enemy helicopters were approaching from the east, bringing additional reinforcements that would make the tactical situation impossible. Her teammates would face overwhelming odds with no possibility of escape. But then she heard another sound that changed everything. The distinctive howl of the A-10's twin engines was echoing off the mountain walls, indicating that the aircraft had returned faster than expected. The pilot's voice confirmed her hopes. All stations, Reaper 27 is back on station with full ammunition load. Request immediate target update. Sarah keyed her radio while tracking enemy positions through her scope. Reaper 27, multiple enemy aircraft inbound from the east. Also have approximately 20 hostiles in assault positions around friendly defensive position. Priority target is the helicopters. The A-10 pilot's response was immediate. Copy, engaging aircraft first, then ground targets. All friendlies stay low. Sarah watched through her scope as the A-10 rolled into an attack run against the approaching helicopters. The enemy aircraft were caught in the open, unable to maneuver effectively while carrying their full load of troops. The Gyu-8 cannon opened fire with its characteristic roar, and the lead helicopter disintegrated in a ball of flame and debris. The second enemy helicopter attempted evasive maneuvers, but the A-10 pilot was relentless. Another burst from the cannon sent the aircraft spinning out of control, crashing into the mountainside in a spectacular explosion that sent black smoke billowing across the valley. With the immediate air threat eliminated, Sarah could focus on supporting her teammates' defensive position. Through her scope, she could see enemy soldiers advancing from multiple directions, trying to overwhelm the SEAL position through coordinated assault. Sarah's next shot eliminated an enemy team leader, who was coordinating the assault from the western approach. The .50 caliber bullet ended his commands permanently, and the soldiers he had been directing lost their coordination and took cover among the rocks. The A-10 was now engaging ground targets, its cannon fire devastating the enemy forces that had been advancing on the SEAL position. The massive 30mm rounds turned cover into deadly fragments, and enemy soldiers who had thought themselves safely concealed discovered that few positions could protect against such overwhelming firepower. But Sarah could see that some enemy forces had survived the air strikes and were still maneuvering to attack her teammates. Small groups of soldiers were using the terrain features to avoid the A-10's attention while continuing their assault. On the defensive position, Sarah engaged these remaining threats with methodical precision. Each shot from the Barrett eliminated a specific threat, whether it was a soldier with a heavy weapon, a team leader coordinating movements, or a fighter in a position to threaten her teammates. The massive rifle's power meant that even partial concealment was inadequate protection. As the immediate threats were eliminated, Sarah could see the tactical situation stabilizing. The combination of air support and precision sniper fire had broken the enemy's coordinated assault, leaving only scattered individuals and small groups that posed manageable threats to the defensive position. Commander Mitchell's voice came through her radio, calm but clearly relieved. Viper 1, enemy assault appears to be broken. We have the situation under control. Sarah looked through her scope one final time, scanning the battlefield for any remaining threats. The mountainside was littered with the debris of the battle, but she could see no organized enemy forces remaining in the area. The engagement was over, and her teammates had survived. The extraction helicopters arrived 20 minutes later, American aircraft that landed in the secure zone while providing covering fire with door-mounted machine guns. As Sarah helped load the wounded members of her team aboard the aircraft, she reflected on the engagement that had tested every aspect of her training and experience. Commander Mitchell approached her as they prepared to board the extraction helicopter. "Outstanding work today, Chen. That Barrett made the difference when it counted." Sarah nodded, but her mind was already moving beyond the immediate battle. The enemy forces they had encountered were not typical Taliban fighters, and their equipment and tactics suggested a level of training and support that raised serious questions about the nature of the conflict in this region. As the helicopter lifted off and began the flight back to base, Sarah looked down at the battlefield one final time. The mountainside showed the scars of the engagement, with smoke still rising from the destroyed aircraft in cratered positions. But her teammates were alive, and the mission had been completed successfully. The Barrett .50 caliber rifle lay across her lap, its massive frame still warm from the extended engagement. The weapon had performed flawlessly under extreme conditions, delivering the precision and power that had turned the tide of a desperate battle. Sarah knew that today's action would become part of the rifle's legend, another chapter in the ongoing story of American warriors using superior equipment and training to overcome overwhelming odds. The sun was setting behind the mountains as the extraction helicopter disappeared into the distance, carrying its cargo of veterans who had once again proven that courage, skill, and determination could triumph over any adversary.